each legislation having its own obligations. We look at US privacy legislation. We look at European privacy legislation. Now, it really does depend on where the organization is geographically headquartered or provides its products and services. Hello everybody, welcome back to Privacy Professional Training. My name is Fumi Owolabi and I'm the founder. Today's video, I wanted to talk about the CISSP exam. Now I keep making videos about it because although Privacy Professional Training is helping students pass their privacy exams, I think we cannot ignore the influence of cybersecurity on the work that we do. Now they are different industries in that cybersecurity looks at confidentiality, integrity and availability of assets. And when we look at privacy, we're looking at the protection of personal data. So they're a little bit different, and I do have a couple notes because there's something that I want to talk about specifically for this video. And it's the influence of cybersecurity that directly impacts our privacy work and why I think that the CISSP is definitely a certification that privacy pros should seriously consider. Now, there are other security certifications that you can consider doing. I like the CISSP because I think it demonstrates good knowledge into the inner workings of security. It also gives you a lot of insight into some of those technical conversations that you have with the product team and also with the cybersecurity team. You're able to speak their language in some respect. Now, obviously, we're not going to understand every single thing they know about cryptography. I definitely don't. If you're privacy pro and you understand cryptography, more power to you. But at least at a minimum, I'm able to understand a lot of the concepts that they're talking about. And if I'm not able to do it, then I'm able to write down the word and take a look at it later. So I want to talk about the CISSP exam and just a very few couple of the domains. The domains that I think hinge upon privacy the most. The first domain, I've written down 3 that I think hinge upon privacy. And if you have a differing opinion, leave a comment below. I'm happy to hear. The 3 that I think are most important are, I'll say them and then I'll talk about how there's 8 domains in total for the CISSP exam. The ones I think that are most pertinent to privacy: security and risk management, security operations, and asset security. So I wrote a couple notes about what I want to talk about and how I think that they impact privacy and our work as privacy pros. The CISSP actually has 8 domains. I have a whole video about the resources I used to pass this test, and then also the qualifications that you have to have in order to get the designation after your name as well. I've made a whole video about that, so take a look at that. But these 3 domains I wanted to talk about because for us privacy pros, what is the value, right? You have to think about how is it going to impact my career and what am I going to gain in terms of value from spending time studying for the test. So the first thing I want to talk about is the security and risk domain, which I would probably say is probably the most impactful for our work as privacy pros because it looks at confidentiality, integrity, availability, security policies. Let's talk about that. I don't know what everybody as a privacy pro does, but one of the things you do in a legal capacity is you draft policies and internal documentation that's distributed from organization to organization, business unit to business unit, and employee to employee. So we're constantly drafting policies and we review them to make sure that they have the appropriate language, 1, for the audience, and then 2, to articulate what an individual reading the policy needs to be able to understand from it. Now, I've highlighted security policy because legal obviously does have input into the security policies that are distributed. I'll give you an example. Let's say, for example, a security policy is being distributed about access management, how an employee accesses a building. So this security policy is going to be distributed to employees to let them know this is what we do from a step-by-step perspective in order for you to enter the building, and we distribute that security policy. Now, it might mention the different types of personal data elements that are going to be collected by your employer, for example, in order for you to gain access to the building. Maybe it's a username, a badge, etc. All of those privacy considerations that go into this security policy that's distributed to employees needs to be reviewed by legal to ensure that we have the appropriate legal basis based on geography. Now, sorry if that sounds a little bit technical, but the reason I want to talk about it is although you as a legal professional or legal privacy pro are going to be able to draft a security policy, having that background knowledge on what the security team is looking at is going to help with your drafting. Let's talk about risk management. When we are privacy pros, we're always doing risk management. We're always looking at things from a risk perspective. Can an organization take on this type of risk? So let's talk a lot about risk. When we look at privacy as a whole, we're looking at different legislation in lots of different geographies, each legislation having its own obligations. We look at US privacy legislation. We look at European privacy legislation. Now, it really does depend on where the organization is geographically headquartered or provides its products and services. Always looking at what type of risk is there in a business taking a particular action with personal data, and that influences influences security too. So the security team are also looking at risk. We look at risk in relationship to security, in that assets that are used or the assets that are protected by the security team also influence the types of security that is placed on the personal data. So I hope that makes sense. The asset is managed by the security team, but there's personal data potentially that is contained within that asset. And as such, if a security team chooses to use a specific asset, we have to look at it from a privacy risk too. Is it going to be adequate enough to safeguard the personal data that's being hosted? Or do we need to get a different technology to facilitate the safeguarding of this information? So we look at things from risk. What type of risk profile do we have in one geography to another geography? And what type of repository can we use in both geographies to satisfy our risk tolerance in both geographies? So there's lots of considerations we have to make in relationship to the security team, because it influences safeguarding of the personal data within that asset. Let's talk about legal and regulatory compliance. So where I got these little notes that I wrote is I went on to the CISSP website and I took a look at some of the measures that are being tested in the exam, and this is what they wrote in the section for security and risk management. So again, if you are a privacy pro and you're a lawyer and the role that you play in the privacy program is from a legal advisory standpoint, you're definitely looking at legal regulatory compliance, which again goes back to my discussion on what exactly is it that the law says in one geography to another, and how does that pass out to the advice that we give to the security team on the types of assets that they can use in certain geographies. I'll give a really good example of this. So let's talk about human resource data, right? Let's say, for example, an organization is looking to utilize a specific third-party vendor, right? And this organization, let's call them Company A. Company A has employees globally, and they want to use one vendor in all of the geographies that Company A has employees. So one of the risk management questions or measures that's going to be taken by the security and privacy team is, which HR vendor can we go with? There are security aspects that we're looking at. The security team is going to look at whether or not the HR vendor can provide integrity to the data that's uploaded, and can they ensure that there's confidentiality around that data. From the privacy perspective, we're looking at things like what type of technical and organizational measures are put in place in order to safeguard the information that this HR vendor is going to process for us, and also what types of measures are they going to put in place in the event there's a cross-border data transfer. So there are considerations from both the privacy and security side, and I personally believe that taking a look at the CISSP exam is going to start putting those thoughts into your mindset and framing when you are providing your expertise in privacy. Let's move on to asset security. We're not going to spend so much time on security operations because I think asset security is really pivotal for privacy pros. Asset security looks at identifying and classifying data. That is literally the bread and butter of personal data. Now, why is that important? Because legislation dictates that there are sensitive data elements, right? And that differs geography to geography. There's something called special category of personal data that is in the European Union. When we're looking at the data that a business wants to utilize, we have to classify it. The reason we have to classify it is in the event that it meets a higher threshold or the processing of those personal data elements could be considered high risk, then we have additional obligations. So we're constantly identifying and classifying data, same as the security team, right? They might be classifying it for a different reason, to ensure that it's confidential, to see if it's restricted, to see if it's internal use. But the privacy team is looking at it from we're looking at things from a risk perspective and then also from a legal perspective. If the law says that this identifier is sensitive, there are certain safeguards and obligations a business has. If it is a special category, certain obligations and certain considerations. If it's biometric data, then we have specific biometric privacy laws that we're looking at. We need to be able to classify it as such and identify it as such, and we need to articulate that to our employees to make sure that they're processing in adherence to the law. Let's talk about data lifecycle, right? Processing, the word processing. The word processing influences the data lifecycle because processing is any operation or set of operations on personal data. So we're looking at collection, usage, deletion, archiving, any type of operation. That's not something that's exclusive to privacy. It also influences security, which is why there's so much liaison between our groups. Now let's talk about protection of information assets. Now this might be a bit more security focused. Let me tell you the value in understanding it as a privacy pro. If you are able to understand what the security team is putting in place from a asset protection standpoint, you're able to assess the obligations that we might have under different data protection laws as it pertains to asset protection. Now they do interlink, but having that knowledge is valuable in the event, let's say, for example, a product team is developing something and you need to be able to understand how the asset's going to be protected. If, for example, there's a different category of personal data that is going to be processed by this tool, you'll be able to understand from a security standpoint what type of level of protection is going to be put in place in the event we need to draft a privacy notice letting our consumers know how that product works. So I hope that this was not too terribly technical, but the main aim of this video is to say taking the CISSP is really valuable. it really expands your knowledge depending on which part of the privacy program you work in. It definitely has expanded my own knowledge. It makes me a better practitioner. And although it's not a privacy certification, I still find it very valuable. If you have any comments or questions, or you want to know, different techniques on maybe how to take the test, take a look at my description, and I'll see you in another video.